Hello, everyone. I am going to start this presentation that I titled Law and Disorder, an analysis of Argentina's ambiguous relationship to the law and its connection to corruption. My name is Mariana Stone, and this topic is a little out of my area, but I have a personal interest and a passion for it. I want to start with have you listened a song, a tango by Enrique Santos Discépolo, and it's Cambalache, and we're just going to listen to 1 minute of it, hopefully. Sorry. I know I want to keep listening, but I can't. Uh, if if I couldn't talk to you through the rest of the presentation and I would lose connection, just well, the words in that tango really summarize pretty much this presentation in a nutshell. But I am going to talk to you about a few specific things. The case of a man named Don Santiago. Then I'm going to make some historical references to corruption in the justice system, as definition and causes of corruption, and looking at corruption today and its cultural ramifications. I'm going to move myself around all over the place. Hopefully I'll stay there. That'll be a better place for me. There's a book by Néstor Rubiano called Injusto Destino, and it's about this man, Santiago Bonfile, and his life cut short. He lived a life, the book is about his life and a commitment to justice and what led to his death, as well as the investigation about his murder and the corruption around his investigation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Santiago Bonfile, he was born in 1911 in La Pampa, Argentina, to a farmer. He had 9 sisters. He learned, he's the one right there. He learned to ride a horse even before he learned how to walk. He went to school, to elementary school right there in La Pampa, but he went to high school in Buenos Aires under the tutelage of the Eggy family. The Eggy family is a famous family that breeds horses. They actually breed polo horses that they sell to um, England, to the royal family. But right before Santiago finished his senior year, he was called back home to work at the farm with his father, being the only son. And Santiago essentially grew up a gaucho. He spent most of the time with his horses and racing them, which was very common at that time. And his passion for horses led him to a more formal involvement in his adult life. He became a jockey. Uh, that's an older picture of him, but a younger version of him is trimmed and very short, kind of a short man. He earned the respect of his peers for his honesty, which led him to become a judge anytime we're determining them, who won and the start of the race, it was really just the eye of the judge that would determine the winner, not technology. And this job was reserved for people with undisputed moral solvency. His work was incorruptible, and due to his principled behavior, he often was called actually to resolve and mediate problems in the community that had nothing to do with horse racing. And one thing he was very proud of was that his calls were never appealed. Um, then he later turned his life to public service um, and became a mayor. And he remained a mayor actually during Democratic time and during, sorry, I think there is an outside and there's a dog going by.
So he was a mayor during the democracy and during military time. The military thought he was, he was harmless, and they thought maybe they shared their cause. But Santiago actually had hid people in his farm during the military prosecution so they wouldn't be killed. During his time as mayor, he also donated his salary to the hospital. He was the ambulance. His truck was used to take people back and forth when there was not enough money for an ambulance. And there's countless of stories of his immense role as a benefactor of the town. He simply just spent most of his time helping people. He was adamant about transparency and innovated as a public servant by keeping the books of the town open for review and accountability. But after his tenure as mayor, local farmers began complaining about cattle being robbed in their farms, and not just small numbers, but large sums of it. Complaints would be brought to the police, to the state and local police, and nothing would be done. With little success. So he took it upon himself to investigate this, and he started digging and digging and digging. On the night of March 14th, 1978, Santiago called his son and warned him that he had uncovered serious connections between the robberies and the federal police and what it would be called a cartel or a mafia type of group that was robbing cattle. He was too tired that night to do anything about it, so he told his son he would act on it in the morning. That night, after talking to his son, Santiago Lino Ponfile was murdered. Immediately after his death, they traced connection to a set of twins that were taken into custody. Those twins confessed immediately what they had done, that they had gone into Santiago's house. He had actually let them in, and they shot him in the head. At the time of the arrest, the twins were in possession of the gun used to commit the crime, and local ballistics was run, and they concluded that was the gun used to commit the murder. The twins also point to a third person involved in the crime, who turned out to be one of Santiago's best friends, Raúl Pellejero. In Argentina, though, it's a civil law judicial system. The judge is the one in charge of the investigation. The judge, in this particular case, dismissed the confession taken by the police department, and then he also did not made himself available, appeared to in front of the suspects in order to take a confession for longer than the allowed period by the law. So they lost the opportunity to take a confession from them. And then he also didn't trust the ballistics run locally. He wanted to run another study in Buenos Aires, which is normal, but he did not enforce the chain of custody, evidentiary chain of custody of the gun. And he actually sent the gun with the lawyers of the suspects to Buenos Aires to run a second ballistic test. Of course, well, not of course, but the gun got lost. So the initial confession is thrown out, the gun got lost, the suspects go free. For 10 painful years after this, the son continued the investigation with private investigators and lawyers, all the time receiving, actually uncovering a web of corruption that went all the way to the national level. this whole time, his family and him and lawyers received multiple death threats, and the case ended up being closed for lack of evidentiary support. The community and the family were left to witness an example of deep embedded corruption that left a sobering feeling about right and wrong, about whether does it even matter to do things the right way when the death of somebody so kind and straight up honest, Santiago, would just not be investigated fairly. Corruption, as Theodore Roosevelt described, in a robbery, the thief violates one law. Corruption attacks all laws. In a murder, the murderer takes a life. Corruption attacks all society. A study conducted by the Obama administration, when it was not about when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, they did a study about human rights, corruption, and transparency in the Argentinian government. And they found that in Argentina there appears to be cracks in the ability to apply the law effectively. Conclusions from this report add that the government corruption is worsened by what the report describes as weak institutions and a politicized justice system, which leads to a systemic challenge in the ability to administer laws. Sorry, I was trying to pause this, because the boats keep going by. This report agrees with previous reports by the World Bank and other world organizations. When this report came out, of course, and made their conclusions publicly, it came to no surprise to millions of Argentinians who have grown accustomed to a corrupted public office in every sphere of government. When looking at corruption, of course, first thing I did was looking at the noun itself. What does it mean? Where does it come from? It comes from Latin corrumpere, which means well, I'm pronouncing it weird, but which denotes some type of alteration, and this alteration has a negative connotation. Historical linguists found the use of this word and its first uses of this word actually is representing the opposite of generating life, which I thought it was interesting. And in the modern definition alludes to the abuse of the relationship between people and things. This definition highlights the fact that corruption represents an evil that by its effect denaturalizes the relationship between people. An extended definition of the understanding of corruption points to the confusion between private and public, where actually it is to the benefit of the private and to the detriment of the public. And there's different authors, of course, and from different backgrounds that define corruption differently, and it all alludes to this relationship between the public and the private. Sorry. I decided to take a little historical look at corruption and what it looks like from that perspective. And there's already texts, of course, in the Bible, there's already various references to corruption. Corruption in kings, corruption by friends of kings, tax collectors, and so forth. Greek laws are the first ones to address the issue of corruption, and Roman law was the first one to actually typify it. Around the 16th century, Martin Luther begins filing complaints against the Catholic Church for the sale of indulgences, and over time and history, there's a clear relationship between power and corruption. And across many societies, it appears in history, but it seems that some areas of the world are hit harder than others with corruption. While corruption appears to be a constant in history, and in every country to some degree, some legal system seems to stronger than others in addressing it. And why is it that some countries have legal systems that appear to be more effective than others in dealing with it? There are studies that have associated variables that date back to the colonial heritage of these countries as possible roots in understanding how each country deals with corruption. In a study by Laporta and others, they found a strong correlation between the country's current legal system and the colonial model they belong to. Countries from more Anglo-Saxon colonial models that adopted a common law legal system show higher degree of individual protections and less corruption than countries colonized by France and Spain that adopted a civil law system. Of course, it would be overly simplistic to attribute or the cause of corruption entirely to an analysis of the legal foundation of the country. But the difference between these two systems as it pertains to the role of the judge is significant to consider when we have instances of corrupt and politically handled judges. For example, under common law, a judge makes a ruling, sets precedents, and they inquire extensively into matters before them, but they don't initiate the investigation. They rely on the arguments presented by the parts. Under civil law, the judge is the chief investigator and is usually non-binding, makes rulings that are non-binding, and the judge is often the one to bring in the formal charge. And of course, judges could be considered in countries where corruption is higher as one of the main agents enabling the continuous impunity shown to public officers in countries like Argentina. So I decided to look, as I was looking further at this and looking at the different pictures of degrees of corruption and the perception of corruption around the world. It is difficult to find a judicial institution in any government in the world completely free of corruption. But historians highlight specifically the Spanish tribunals during colonial times as notorious for the normalization of corruptive practices. Historians over this period seem to have an almost unanimous opinion to the degree of inefficiency and corruption of the Spanish court. There's extensive reports of manipulation of the legal code in which the elite class would basically ignore the law and the working class, it wasn't relevant for them. Initially, the Spanish Empire attempted to establish a uniform legal system through its colonies, but they soon faced the inability to do that because they were facing a politically and physically disintegrated empire, which they disintegrated. And the laws coming from Spain were what they called acknowledged but not followed. This disregard for what the colonists perceived as outdated laws coming from Spain became a way of life not just for special royal mandates, but for everyday practices by local political officers. In the colonial times, having a job in the courts became one of the most lucrative positions for the elite. Those positions became spaces to help people grow their own wealth, benefit their own family, and not necessarily work for the interests of the community. In this context, corruption became generalized, institutionalized, and legitimized. And another important thing that historians point out is that the king, Spain, established what they call an audiencia, and it was an official body in charge of administrative and legal duties. And this lack of separation of powers from the beginning opened the door for continual and habitual abuses. There was a report filed in 1729 by Antonio Manso, who denounced numerous instances of magistrates hiring relatives to work in key official positions. Officers who were occupied government positions and while still owning a business, does that sound familiar? And using their official role to benefit themselves and many others. And they found many other violations. The report by Manso concluded that this mediocre arrangement of in which the administration of justice is not in the place where it should be will lead to a total ruin of the colonies. In this report, Manso also points out that the blame partially falls on the crown for not paying the officers a decent living and lend themselves to start working around those bribes that are coimas that are common in Argentina. Sorry. Now, corruption as a cultural norm and a reality is a reality both in developed and less developed nations. But sorry, I was thinking of a different. I know we don't call it less developed nations, but I forgot the name for it. Bobo sheds light into the degree of political maturity, institutional strength, and understanding of civic. Got dark in here, didn't it? Of civic political maturity of the population is the degree of tolerance that society has against those practices and how the justice system reacts. In Argentina, there's a high threshold of tolerance towards corruption, partly due to this justice system full of judges and DAs that have what we call la vista gorda. They sort of looked over very complacent and giving impunity and protected public officers. Citizenry has grown accustomed to a disregard of the law and the legal process, which translates into people's everyday lives as a mirrored or blurred relationship to the law itself, where taking advantage is the norm, where those who race to power using those strategies are considered smart, where it's expected to act like that if you want to get ahead or to make it. Citizens and experts continue to consider corruption as one of the main problems to keep Latin America from progressing and providing a successful experience. Actually, on one hand, I don't know why I put on one hand, but 8 out of 10 Latin Americans insist that their government is corrupt. And the perception of increasing corruption has also gone up as one of the main causes. I don't know, I'm reading this, it doesn't make sense. I'm going to rework that, but I'm already recording this and I don't want to start again because I'm reading that slide and it's wrong. The point that I'm trying to make is that although the citizenships perceive corruption at the government level, they perceive it as an external point, not internalized as something that actually is part of their everyday life too. That they don't see themselves represented in any way, that the corruption in the government is really external to them, as if it has nothing to do with what people do every day. Traditionally, and in some societies more than others, there have been behaviors adopted by communities that by today's standards could be considered corrupt, like going through a contact to secure a contract, to make payments to facilitate a project, to give and receive gifts after granting support for a project. All those behaviors, as a matter of quid pro quo, are in many cases at the heart of lobbyist jobs and many economic exchanges, but they are still immoral. In some of these countries, corruption becomes part of a daily life and the normal development of business, producing ample tolerance towards a culture of illegality that gives this general sense that some groups of society, the law does not apply to them. This belief ends up being an intrinsic part of the culture of a country that minimizes corruption as a systemic flaw. Corruption can become institutionalized as an informal system of norms and practices that shapes individuals' thinking and behavior. Under circumstances of institutional corruption, individuals see this as a standard process to get things done, rather than as a deviant behavior that violates the norm. The impunity given by the justice system is one of the other problems. A country with weak institutions tends to have a judicial system that is extremely sensitive to political pressures and economic influence. Judges are constantly seen as judges that swing towards power. They tend to start strong at the beginning of a new presidential election, and as they perceive the shift of power changing to the next president, they start swinging to the other side, basically. When the law becomes partial, then corruption attacks the foundation of social obligations, and in this context, actions that are not prohibited by the law would appear to be legitimate. So the independence of the judiciary is practically the only point of agreement in which there's like a unanimous consensus in the literature I was reviewing for this, in terms of fighting corruption. Where the judicial mechanisms does not function efficiently, corruption is out of control. And that is essentially what happened in the case of Santiago Pamphile. The justice system failed to work.